Okay. The next broadcast has been put out by Ligonier, and so this is for July 2nd, 2010. The message is entitled Justice, Mercy, and Grace. So it continues on with this series. So I wanted to share some more of this with you since that's what we're discussing. So
what
enjoy.
does the sovereign God of the universe owe you? Stay tuned. Dr. R.C. Sproul will explore this question next on Renewing Your Mind. Welcome to this Friday edition of Renewing Your Mind with author, teacher, and theologian Dr. R.C. Sproul. Dr. Sproul is also the Senior Minister of Preaching and Teaching at St. Andrew's, a Reformed congregation in Sanford, Florida. When we talk about someone owing someone else, we're talking about indebtedness or obligation. When we're the ones in debt, mercy and grace are very appealing concepts to us. When someone owes us, justice becomes more appealing. That question again is, what does the sovereign God of the universe owe you? To answer that question accurately, we first need to understand the definition of sovereign. Once that's established, then and only then can we see the scales of justice in perfect balance. Today, as we continue with our series on predestination, Dr. Sproul will explain some key terms that are essential for a proper understanding of this biblical doctrine. With more on that, here's Dr. Sproul with today's lecture, Justice, Mercy, and Grace.
Before we plunge once again into our study of the doctrine of election, let me give you a little commercial to start off with, because so many people have been asking me about this in the studio audience after the lecture. I have written a book for laypersons on this doctrine of election entitled Chosen by God, which is published by Tyndale House Publishers and is found in most any Christian bookstore. And I've been really surprised about that book for this reason. When I wrote it, I felt like I'm probably speaking to the choir here, and that the only people who ever will read this book will be people who are already persuaded of the doctrine of predestination, and maybe it'll have some value to shore them up and help them go a little deeper into it. But what has actually happened has completely amazed me. I have literally, and I'm speaking literally now, heard from thousands of people who have told me that the reading of that book persuaded them to change their mind on this doctrine, and that they now embrace the historic Augustinian view of it, and that has pleased me greatly. And what they have said, and this is the feedback I'm getting from the layperson, is that the book has helped them understand many of the difficult questions that attend this doctrine. So I just mentioned that to you in passing. But I mentioned in our last time, as we were looking at Romans 9, that Paul anticipates the biggest objection that people raise against the doctrine of election, namely that this would cast a shadow on the righteousness of God. It would make God seem to be somehow unjust. And Paul raises the question in Romans 9, is there unrighteousness in God? And he answers his own question by saying, absolutely not. And then verse 15 of Romans chapter 9 says this, for he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whomever I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whomever I will have compassion. So then, this is the conclusion, it is not of him who wills, nor of him who runs, but of God who shows mercy. Now, in circles in which I travel and hear about discussions on the doctrine of predestination or of election, sometimes the lingo, the language, the nomenclature that I hear out there is that the Augustinian doctrine of election, notice I'm not calling it the Calvinistic doctrine of election, because that raises the hackles on everybody's neck, because Calvin has been so maligned. But again, I want you to know that Calvin really did not write all that much on this doctrine, and what he did write had already been written in greater detail by Luther and earlier by Augustine, and it's more appropriate to identify this historic position with Augustine than it is with Calvin. But so often in the nomenclature of those who discuss this doctrine, they will refer to doctrines surrounding the concept of election as the doctrines of grace. I like that designation because it puts the accent where it belongs. Because the focal point of the biblical doctrine of election is the concept of the grace of God. And let's start there today. What are we talking about when we're talking about grace? Grace is defined most simply by the phrase unmerited favor. That is, when we receive grace from God, we receive a blessing or a favor or some benefit from His hand that we have not deserved, we have not earned, we have not merited. It comes gratuitously, simply from the wideness of His mercy to us. Now, again, this is where Paul directs our thinking when the question is raised, is there unrighteousness in God? And he says, absolutely not. And then he immediately reminds the Roman Christians who are to receive this letter, this epistle from his hand, of what God had already revealed in the Old Testament to Moses, where God said, I will have mercy upon whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion upon whom I will have compassion. That the first thing we have to understand about God's grace is that grace is sovereign. Grace is something that God is never obligated to give. God doesn't owe anybody grace. Think about this for a moment. If God owed us grace, it wouldn't be grace. It would be justice. Justice is something that is due as a reward or as a punishment for certain forms of behavior. Grace is not required. And God always and everywhere reserves the right of what I call cosmic executive clemency. This is executive privilege on His part. He can be merciful to whom He wants to be merciful, and He can withhold His mercy or His grace from whomever He decides to withhold that mercy for whatever reason He is inclined so to do, in order to accomplish His purposes, not our agenda. Now, Paul, at least in the English translation I'm reading from, asks this question, and we're going to look at it again. Is there unrighteousness in God?
Okay, and we're going to stop there for the sake of time, and we'll pick it up with the next video.